I don't know if you can hear me. My name is Annette from the Danish administration, the Danish Ministry of Environment. Can I pose a question? I don't know if I'm the only one.
Yeah, no, I can hear you. There's another lady from the Netherlands waiting, but she was supposed to be ahead of you. But anyway, Annette, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to ask you if you can. I mean, I somehow sense that this ecosystem approach, the lack of knowledge, perhaps, I don't know, or recognition of the history of it and the importance of it, is somehow linked to, how should I say, the lack of implementation and the establishment of new work areas. Or can you elaborate a little bit more on that and what it actually means for our work?
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I mean, I think it is something that's been forgotten. It is something that was generated within the first decade. It was clearly said that this is the approach that we want to use to manage the convention. And as I say, it's actually, of course, it is about ecosystems, but it's also very much about people and their interaction with ecosystems, which is what the convention, in a way, is also about. And the fact that it is not being taken up and particularly used, or rather confused also with ecosystem-based approaches, which FAO like for their fisheries work and so on and so forth, I think that's really a problem. For me, although the 12 principles have not changed really since they were first coined in 1998. And so you might think, well, isn't that a bit old? It's surely something new. Frankly, not really, because they are very high-level principles, but they actually guide you. I mean, one of the principles is that change is inevitable. Now, that sounds maybe trite, but actually it's not, because a lot of the discussions that I hear in the CBD increasingly kind of assume that change is not going to happen, or that some kind of change is not reversible. So just going back and reflecting on the principles, I think, is a really good thing to do. And now it's paragraph 20 of the KMGBF, which I suspect a lot of people haven't latched onto or even realized, that framework is supposed to be implemented in the context of those 12 principles, which for me makes a lot of sense. I don't know if that answers your question, but you're muted.
Sorry, I was nodding. No, fine, thanks.
Okay, right. So the Netherlands is waiting.
Yes, good morning, and thank you very much. And I hope you can hear me well, because I think the connection is not great from my side. So thanks a lot for the very insightful presentation. I think it's very useful to have some of the history as well. I've only stepped into the CBD a short 3 years ago. But I'm also interested to know two things. On the one hand, how do you look ahead? And what do you think is really needed to actually move to implementation rather than redoing discussions in maybe some different words? And maybe a second, because the end of the presentation didn't finish very hopeful. How do you remain hopeful? Thank you.
Okay. Look, sorry if it didn't remain hopeful. I was hoping that it would be not totally unhelpful. Yeah, look, yes, I am hopeful, because I believe that there is still plenty of opportunity. The implementation thing, though, I think has to be tackled seriously and tackled head on. And by that, I mean that there has to be a more explicit recognition, particularly by the Secretariat in Montreal is like a Mandarin state. They do not really fully comprehend that to implement their convention, they can actually do nothing, because implementation of the Biodiversity Convention can only happen at best at national level, most usually at regional or local level, or even in your own backyard. And that's why implementation is an important element, but parties never discuss how do we implement this? We'll create some guidelines, but what does that mean? Do we then go back and start implementing those guidelines or give the guidelines to the relevant people? And you find that CBD delegations very often are coming from ministries that don't actually have the levers that could actually be pulled to implement some of the decisions. So it's at the national level where the rubber should be hitting the road, and that's where I think the problems are. They're not unique to CBD, by the way. I mean, the same problems can be had in Ramsar, because very often there, most of the delegates from countries in Ramsar tend to be almost self-selected to be keen on wetland conservation or migratory birds or whatever, and they want to deal with those things, but they don't actually have the connections, even with people from the CBD, even if they might be their next door offices. So we have this kind of bizarre silo system, both nationally, and then that gets translated internationally.
Okay, thanks a lot. And
but be hopeful. Be hopeful.
Yeah.
Don't so. Yes.
No, I'm
if you're not
hopeful. No worries.
Yeah.
But
Because
but
if you're not hopeful, we're all done for.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Bridgewater, and thank you also, participant for the question, and particularly thank you so much for joining us for Australia, where it's already getting dark, I imagine.
It is already done. It is already, even though we're now on daylight saving, it's still dark.
Okay.
Okay,
So
I will leave you now, and I wish you all a very successful day and a very successful project. I will keep my eyes on it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.
Bye.
So now I will give the floor to Professor Rosendahl from the Fridtjof Institute, Norway, who will present us the negotiation outputs of the CBD on the general framework of the convention. So same as precedently, you will be able to ask questions immediately after the presentation.
Thank you very much, Pierre. I hope you all can hear me, and a good morning to all of you. I'm going to try to share my presentation with you. Let me see now. Yes, should be this one. While I'm waiting for this to to happen, I would also like to say thank you very much to Professor Bridgewater. I really liked your presentation a lot, and I think that you will see that we are in for a good division of labor, because unlike Professor Bridgewater, I will be concentrating on some of the controversies. I mean, that's what you get when you ask a political scientist to do a presentation. So, is this now visible to all of you, the presentation here?
It worked perfectly. Thank you.
It's good the way it is. So, yeah, my name is Kristine Rosendahl, and I'm a research professor at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Norway. And this is a non-profit research institute foundation, and we focus on, we are mostly political scientists, and we mostly do work on international environmental and resource management types of policies and legal issues and questions. So that's it. And I will also present you with the history of the Convention on Biodiversity. And I think, Pierre, you sent out this little guide on acronyms. Yeah, because you see, I hope you'll find it helpful. It's these international negotiations are just rife with their own terminology. And I will not probably have time to, spell out all of it all the time. So hopefully this will be useful. Okay. Let me see now. Just a quick presentation of how my talk is organized. I'm going to talk about the nature crisis, how it's been looked upon from a scientific point of view, the scientific agreement about this. I'm also going to talk about the North-South conflict. At the time, we talked about North-South, not the global South, but so this is sort of just a kind of language that will be hanging in there. But and most people would say that the North-South conflict is not so outspoken anymore, but there are remnants of the old conflict, and I think this is important for understanding how the biodiversity issue is still treated today. And then I'll move on to talk about the efforts to resolve this nature and biodiversity loss crisis. I'll talk about the CBD, but I'll talk in particular about the access and benefit sharing regime of the CBD, because I think a lot of the conflicts still center around this really difficult issue between developed and developing countries, or you might say richer countries, poorer countries. So this is also where we will find some of the barriers to implement the CBD biodiversity goals. And I'll go into some of these barriers, like, for instance, the lack of quick fix investments and technology solutions. I think that sort of sets biodiversity conservation a little bit apart from the other conventions that are dealing with pollution and emissions, because it's a little bit easier to get the private sector to invest in renewables, for instance, than it is to make them invest in conservation and protecting areas. So, okay, just to give you a snapshot of what is it that we actually know about biodiversity loss. We know since the late 1980s, there has been scientific agreement that this loss is so many times faster than what is called the natural background rate, what you can read out of the fossils, and see that this is really changed with human activities. The speed has picked up so much, and there is definitely scientific agreement about that. Numbers like 25% of mammal species are becoming extinct, more than 40% of amphibians are threatened, and 50% of the wetlands have been lost, 33% of coral reefs seriously damaged, all of this in the last sort of 100 years. Another interesting way of picturing this is to put all the humans and all the domesticated animals into one big pile, and then you will get 96% of the biomass, and only 4% are the wild mammals. This, is a very strong picture of our world today when it comes to biodiversity and biodiversity loss. And also the fact that about 3/4 of the land has been significantly altered by human activities. So, but there is not only scientific agreement about the state of the loss, there's also agreement about the gravity of the loss. We know that this will lead to more, increase in zoonoses, like we just had now with the corona diseases jumping from animals to humans, because humans are just moving so close to the little pieces of land left to wildlife. There's also the awareness now that the loss of biodiversity means very strong reduction in pollution, in pollination, sorry, and also it leaves us very much threatened by flooding, because when the vegetation is gone, like the mangrove forests along the coast, millions and millions of people are more exposed to flooding. And these are, again, scientifically agreed facts. And we know that it's mainly human caused. It's primarily due to land use change, a little bit less also due to pollution, climate change, and invasive alien species. And there is today a very strong agreement among the IPCC and IPBES. You know these acronyms now, I assume. They both agree that the nature and the climate crisis are very much intertwined, and they need to be resolved in tandem somehow. But I agree with the Professor Bridgewater. We should probably not leave this to the Climate Change Convention alone. Okay, another thing that happened as UNEP and the states of the world started negotiating this biodiversity convention was at the time there was also an increased attention to the value of biodiversity. It's not as though it sort of suddenly popped up, but I think it was to do also with the developments in biotechnology. For a long time, it had been realized that agriculture, aquaculture depends on access to a diversity of genetic material to retain the high yields, to adapt to climate change, and to resist diseases. And also, it was realized that a lot of this diversity was found in countries in the south. Center of diversity for food plants, mostly confined to what is called the global south countries. And seeds had been collected for a long time and stored in the international seed banks. So that was the state of the world affairs at the time. Also, it was realized that less than 1% of all the plants, insects, marine and microbiological organisms had been bioprospected. That means examined for medicinal and chemical traits. And bioprospecting was really picking up at the time. The systematic search in nature for all of these interesting genetic information that could be used for commercial value. So this realization of the rapid loss and the high value put the issue of biodiversity square on international agendas. Okay, let's move on a bit. This is really just a snapshot, but I just wanted to put this up here that these patent applications are mostly in the hands of very large multinational corporations that control about 50% of the global transactions with seeds. Those are 3 multinational corporations. These are kind of guesstimates, but quite central for understanding the increased concentration in and the governance of genetic resources. The concentration of the market control here is really quite high, and I think it's sort of lying underneath some of the issues that we are discussing when we are discussing access and benefit sharing and conservation of biodiversity. So, what was happening at the time? Well, Professor Bridgewater already mentioned some of this. There had been a number of efforts to try to stop the loss of biodiversity prior to the CBD. The conservation of wildlife was at the center, wildlife only, and it was sector-based, so that you had migratory species with the CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species. You had the Ramsar Convention on wetlands, the ecosystem approach there. You had CITES focusing on trade with international trade in endangered species of flora and fauna. But then came the CBD, and the whole idea moved from a sector-based to a very comprehensive approach to conservation of biodiversity. But also, and this is quite important, it moved from concentrating only on wild species to also include the valuable domesticated species. And this was, of course, what also contributed to a much more controversial environment, you might say, in the negotiations, because there was this quite interesting thing that the users of biodiversity had a very different agenda than the providers of biodiversity. And we shall look into that a little bit more. I think just understanding this this North-South conflict at the time of negotiating the Biodiversity Convention, these are sort of the 5 factors shaping the regime formation of the conventional biodiversity. Because first of all, the bulk of terrestrial species diversity is found in tropical areas. Also the plant genetic resources, the seeds that we were talking about, the centers of diversity. And then it was being realized that these genetic resources were really the input factors for biotechnology. And not only the resources, but also the traditional knowledge, for instance, about the medicinal traits. A few years back, the world had moved from primarily doing research on food and medicines within the public sector. Now, increasingly, the private sector was also moving in here and doing part of that job. With that came a need for reimbursement, of course. And that meant that the private sector doing research in agriculture and pharmaceuticals needed patents and intellectual property rights to protect the results of their investments. But the problem was that the patents was not so much applicable in the poorer countries, because you really need quite a high level of technological and economical strength in order to make use of intellectual property rights in your innovation. So at the time, the South at the time and the global South now argued and argues still that why should we just give away our genetic resources for free, then carry the cost of biodiversity conservation, and then pay for patented medicines, for instance, even some of the seeds, although most of the seeds are freely accessible through the international gene banks. So another thing, just to make this a little bit more complicated, while negotiating the conventional biodiversity, there were also other negotiation processes taking place in global arenas. Very importantly, you had the Uruguay round, which transformed the GATT into the World Trade Organization. With the World Trade Organization came also TRIPS, which is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. It's an agreement that seeks to harmonize and strengthen intellectual property rights in all the countries party to the WTO, and also in all technological sectors, including biotechnology. And this was really new. Patents and IPR had not been used in the life sciences before because it hadn't really been applicable. It didn't really meet the patent criteria, but increasingly biotechnology made that possible. Okay, so that was happening in the World Trade Organization at the same time that the conventional biodiversity was being negotiated. And also, what was also quite important to understand and realize is that the FAO had an undertaking on plant genetic resources, on seeds. And this undertaking was changed in 1989, just the same time as the negotiations on CBD were going on. And seeds were no longer seen as just a common heritage of mankind, but it could be subject to intellectual property rights, like strong plant breeders' rights. And this really enraged a lot of the developing world because they saw that seeds had been picked in their countries, stored in international gene banks, could now be accessed for free and controlled by the big seed corporations. So again, this made the whole awareness at the time like this. The increased biotechnological ability to exploit genetic resources and the strengthened patent regimes gave the North like all the benefits from utilizing genetic resources, with very little benefits going directly to the South, at least in monetary terms. At the same time, the global distribution of biodiversity gave the South sort of the bulk of responsibility and the costs for doing conservation work. But and less of the costs directly falling on the North. So again, in the CBD, the users of the resource are asking the owners of the resource to conserve these resources. And this gave the South quite a leverage in the negotiations, and we shall see. It was also, really fueled by these stories about biopiracy. One was about the rosy periwinkle that was used for some cancer treatments, and Eli Lilly was accessing this plant in Madagascar, earning tons of dollars, and Madagascar got nothing. And this story appeared in New Scientist in 1990. So it was really fueling, these negotiations at the time. And it was not the only story. There was many stories like that. So this is important for understanding the sentiments and how people were thinking about this at the time of negotiating the CBD. It's made a very strong impact. Then came 1992 and Rio, and the Convention on Biodiversity was signed. It now has 196 parties, so it's almost all the UN parties, right? It's all the nations in the world except for the United States of America. It's still not a party. It's the US signed but never ratified the convention. And the CBD got its 3 objectives: the conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity, and the equitable sharing of benefits from utilization of genetic resources. This ABS regime, and it's been a controversy ever since. I think a lot of people would agree with Professor Bridgewater that this has really been hampering implementation, because everybody's always talking about synthetic biology, digital sequence information now, and these are sort of the heresy, the heritage of the Convention on the access and benefit sharing regime of the Convention on Biodiversity. We have already heard about the exit targets. We know that in Nagoya, also at the time, there was a protocol on access and benefit sharing. It's the same as the parties agreed to in 1992. It just sort of strengthens the access and benefit sharing part of the convention. And I'm also going to finally mention what happened in Montreal last November, when the parties at COP15 agreed on the Global Biodiversity Framework. So, but first of all, just a few more words then on access and benefit sharing. This 3rd objectives, it concerns the equitable sharing from use. It has some principles regarding what should you do about accessing these resources when you come from abroad into another country. It's very important to realize that the CBD is about international transactions. It doesn't say anything about how you should distribute these benefits within the country. This is an international treaty, not one dictating what you do inside the country. So it should be on mutually agreed terms. If you're a company or a university wanting to do research on the genetic resources in another country, this is what you should do. You should, make these agreements about mutually agreed terms, and it should be based on prior informed consent. And I think it's maybe almost forgotten, but at the time, this was really seen as a big victory for developing countries. They were saying things like, in Rio, climate change was theirs. The North was, getting that convention, but biodiversity was ours. We really, for the first time, we had acceptance for some of our claims for sharing, the benefits of utilizing resources in the world. They had been trying to get a new economic world order in various venues for a long time, and this was really the first sort of well, definitely a symbolic victory, but nonetheless a victory for developing countries. And I think also there is very good evidence to support that this ABS system is the main reason why the US never wanted to ratify the convention, because on all other aspects they are fulfilling the convention objectives probably better than a lot of other countries. So and then we should also look a little bit more into how these CBD and the ABS is interacting with these other agreements. Because while the CBD is an agreement on the conservation and sustainable use and benefit sharing, of course you have agreements on the World Trade Organization and TRIPS, saying that you should strengthen the patents and the intellectual property rights also for the results of biotechnology. And also in the FAO with access to seeds. For the FAO parties, it's more important to contribute to access and not so important to contribute to monetary benefit sharing. And that's where there's a bit of a tension between the FAO and the CBD, has been throughout and still is actually. What is important and interesting is that you find a similar interaction between the CBD and the World Health Organization. And I would just like to give you an example of that, because I think it's actually quite interesting. You know, we just seen a pandemic. In about 2007-8, there was another pandemic that the World Health Organization really had to deal with, and that was avian flu. And at the time, the World Health Organization approached Indonesia, where this pandemic was really making itself felt, and asking whether Indonesia would let them have access to some of the virus strains, so that they could you know, give this to industry so that they could develop vaccines. We all know how important that is. And then Indonesia said, of course, you shall have it. But then we want free access to the vaccine, because we are a poor country, we can't afford it, and we really struggle with this disease here. And then the World Health Organization said, sorry, we can't do that, because we can't override the interests of industry, and they need to patent these vaccines. That's just the name of the game. So it was quite an interesting sort of stalemate for a bit. But then the situation was more or less resolved with negotiating a framework agreement called PIP, the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. And PIP does something quite novel in international affairs. It grants fast-track access to the viruses, and it grants fast-track access to the vaccine for the poorer countries. So a real compromise then. And it was definitely influenced or you know, motivated somehow by the access and benefit sharing regime of the CBD. So it's, for political scientists like myself, it's very interesting to sort of trace these effects across international arenas. But it does signal that some of the CBD principles have some actual implementation effects in the state of the world affairs. And one can agree or disagree with it, but that's the name of the game. Okay, now we are moving further in time, and for the time being, there are still quite a few unresolved issues among the negotiating parties that meet in the COPs every second year to look into how the CBD is being implemented, how it can be strengthened. And one of these really contested issues has to do with the very definition of genetic resources and genetic material, because at the time it was defined as and in terms of functional units of heredity. And that turned out to be quite a stumbling block for developing countries, because as time goes by and technologies are evolving and emerging, it is now possible to store genetic information in terms of digital sequence information. And of course, that could be very hard to conflate with the definition in terms of functional units of heredity. But then the developing countries will say that, yeah, but the whole idea of ABS was to grasp the value of the genetic information. So if you take out all of that, it's going to undermine the whole idea of the access and benefit sharing regime, and it probably will. But this is what you get. Now you have a big controversy, and the controversy is spreading to the FAO. We've seen it in the negotiations on the law of the sea, and there they actually agreed to create a fund for this, and that is also what we will see coming out of the negotiations last year. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So the thing here is just to give you an idea how these sort of deep-rooted conflicts are still making it very tough for the parties to come to agreement in also today. If we look at national implementation activities, as we should, and as also Professor Bridgewater reminded us is a very important thing, we see that the CBD parties have actually enacted 279 policy measures to implement the ABS regime. But only 24 of these parties have actual ABS procedures, and these you find mostly among the provider countries. So most of the user countries never really implemented policies or legislation to make for a very efficient implementation of the third objective of the CBD. Here, the EU is almost the odd man out, because EU really follows a lot of the access and benefit sharing norms. They include genetic information, not only functional units of heredity, in their ABS regulation. So that could be like enzymes would still be seen as a genetic resource. This is totally in line with what the developing world would really like to see in user country implementation. And the same, they also accept monetary benefit sharing. This is also different from most other user countries who will talk about benefit sharing, but mostly in kind, not so much really monetary benefit sharing. And third, what the EU has done is to link the access and benefit sharing legislation also to patent systems. This is a legal term called disclosing origin of genetic material. You can make that mandatory in your patent system and say that you really have to disclose and tell about where you found this material in order to get a patent. And of course, the patent system is like 10 times as strong as ABS, because ABS is only like 10 years old after the Nagoya Protocol entered into force. But the patent system has been around for more than 100 years. It's also very tricky, but it has a long history of being implemented. So for developing countries, it's very important that this ABS is sort of linked to the patent system, because then it makes it so much more easy to monitor where is this genetic material originating from. And then it could also be possible to share some of the revenue coming out of it, because that's part of the problem with ABS. It's very hard to monitor. I should also mention that Norway and Switzerland have similar acts, but apart from that, very, very few other user countries have done anything like this. So again, lack of implementation. I've been talking at length now about the third objective of the CBD, which is good because there was a very good division of labor with Professor Bridgewater. But now I would also like to just mention a little bit about the achievements regarding the other objectives, like the IT targets. There was so little achievement at the global level. It's not too bad, you know. They were saying that we should protect 17% of land and 10% of oceans. What we got in around 2020 was about 15% of land, 8% of the oceans protected. But then again, what about the quality of this protection? It's very hard to judge. So 6 of the 20 targets were partially achieved, but that was about it. So in 2020, the Aichi targets were more or less seen as a failure at the UN level by the CBD. But the other side of that was that the hopes were really high for this new global biodiversity framework. Prior to the meeting, the COP meeting taking place, it was supposed to be in Kunming, but it moved to Montreal due to COVID, right? But China still presided over the event. It was the first time that China was hosting, actually, a big global event like that. So let me just wrap up and talk a little bit about the achievements at the Montreal Kunming meeting last year. Compared to what we had before, the ambitions are very much higher, definitely. Now the ambition is to protect 30% of the land, 30% of the oceans, to restore 30% of already degraded ecosystems. There were also agreement that the countries should reduce harmful subsidies by $500 billion by 2030. Really ambitious plans. And also to mobilize $200 billion annually by, I think there's a billion drop there, by 2030 in biodiversity funding. And also to strengthen the Global Environment Facility by an annual US dollars, again, billion US dollars by 2030. But probably more important for our ability to do something about implementation is that along with this happening, there is now also a lot going on with creating a new accounting system to evaluate nature. It means that nature costs must be included in the definition also of the green transition. For instance, when it comes to biofuels, when it comes to mining for rare minerals, etc., etc. That could actually be something that could make a bit of a difference. But the critics would say that COP15 was still ripe with gaps, such as the big gap between what we promised to fund and what we actually put on the table in terms of actual money. Also, there are very few targets when it comes to halting specific species reduction. So that's probably also going to be problematic because the species are extinguished one by one by all these small piecemeal land use change decisions at the local level. And of course, there's the uncertain future of access and benefit sharing and the digital sequence information that I've told you about. This definition is going to be sort of haunting the further implementation of the CBD for years to come. The DSI could still undermine the IDS regime. there was an agreement on the multilateral mechanism, and it was only in the last minute, actually, of the negotiations in Montreal in November last year that all the countries agreed to this. A lot of the African countries were fighting this until the very end, but China was able to get everybody to agree on this multilateral mechanism and a global fund based on the utilization of DSI. But the modalities of this global DSI fund remains to be worked out. So actually, a number of developing countries made it clear that if no such modalities are being worked out to their satisfaction, they will no longer be part of the global biodiversity framework. So what is the scope for success? I think when we political scientists try to say something about the scope for success, we look at first the way things are institutionally designed. You can do quite a lot with that, but there's only so far you can go by making a more effective design of institutions. I will talk a little bit about that, but I will also talk about, what is really hampering implementation is the different interests that are still very much part of this picture. So when it comes to institutional design, there are some really good methods and ways to make the CBD work. There's quite a functioning monitoring and reporting system. These are the national biodiversity strategies that the countries are reporting every second or any number of years to see what's actually happening on the ground, which is quite important. It's also important to have clear targets so that you can really measure, are we getting closer or not? This can also be monitored. But then when it comes to really mobilize funding, that is still a very tricky part of the implementation. So it could be the major stumbling block. And we have already seen that there is quite a malign problem structure in terms of the interests involved in the Biodiversity Convention and its implementation. Even though there is this scientific agreement, which is so important, it's certainly not sufficient. We have had now more attention, but most of the attention is still on climate change, and biodiversity is still sort of not so important, it seems. There is also the lack of knowledge actually at the local level, because in very broad terms, we have these broad ideas about what we're losing and what that means, but at the local level, there is very often a shortage of knowledge. What exactly is that installation going to do about the local biodiversity? How is it going to affect how that ecosystem works, etc. And I think a very important part of the explanation why it's so hard to implement this is that protection just lacks technological quick fixes and also investment options. It's very hard to get the private sector engaged really in being part of this green shift. You see that for climate change, this is a little bit different. I mean, it's still a very hard upward struggle, but for biodiversity, the struggle is even tougher because there are so few direct investment possibilities. How can you make money on protection? It's very hard. I think we should also again think about the importance of scientific knowledge and the great job that the IPCC has been doing for climate change. But the IPCC was actually set up in 1988, so they are about 25 years ahead of IPBES when it comes to communicating this consolidated and agreed scientific knowledge that we have when it comes to the nature crisis. And just a very small piece at the end about this funding. The promise was that the global biodiversity framework should have an annual US $30 billion by 2030. But in reality, the Global Environment Facility has provided about $23 billion US dollars in total for the past 30 years. And this has been for biodiversity, for climate, for ocean pollution, etc. So the gap between the promise and the reality is still staggeringly high. And now we're talking about, of course, funding from the rich part of the world to the poorer part of the world. But still, to end on a slightly more optimistic note, I think we should still consider the counterfactual situation. What would the world seem like if we did not have this constant pressure with the COPs going on every second year and the conventional biodiversity? Probably would not have been achievements at all in this part. But also, I think as I'm talking to you guys from the EU and looking at how the EU has actually been kind of a bridge builder between the North and the Global South in the Biodiversity Convention implementation, with the achievements on access and benefit sharing legislation, for example, it's possible to consider this sort of vacant spot for leadership. There's never been a leader in the CBD negotiations. Countries are sort of struggling along and saying that, yeah, we need to do something, but there hasn't been really a big push, I guess, except for the EU, which is sometimes trying to put on that hat, but could also imagine to do that even a bit more in the years to come. So that was what I wanted to say. So thank you very much for your attention and questions.